Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back in time. As the modern world fades away, I invite you to settle into a comfortable position, perhaps drawing a warm blanket close as we travel to a place both familiar and foreign, the streets of Victorian London. Tonight's historical tale is designed to help you unwind, to let your mind wander through the cobblestone streets of the past as you drift toward peaceful slumber. I'm curious to know where in our vast world you're listening from tonight. Is the sun setting outside your window? Or perhaps you're seeking a moment of calm in the early hours of morning? Please share in the comments below. I find such joy in seeing our community gather from different corners of the globe, united by our fascination with history's quiet lessons. If you find comfort in these historical journeys, consider subscribing so you won't miss future tales from distant times. Each story is crafted to transport you away from daily concerns and into the gentle embrace of history's endless tapestry. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and digital hum of our modern age. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow yourself to slip backward through time, to the foggy streets of 19th century London, where gas lamps flicker, and the greatest city of the British Empire reveals its two very different faces. The year was 1853, and London stood as the proud capital of the most powerful empire the world had ever known. Morning light spilled across the grand white facades of Belgravia's townhouses, their windows gleaming like polished jewels. Inside one such residence on Eaton Square, Lady Eleanor Harrington moved unhurriedly through her morning routine, attended by no fewer than 3 servants. "I believe we shall take breakfast in the conservatory today, Mills," she instructed her butler as she descended the marble staircase, her silk dress rustling softly with each step. "The morning light is particularly fine, and I wish to enjoy my correspondence amid the orchids." The West End of London represented everything the British Empire wished to project about itself: order, elegance, prosperity, and refinement. Carriages with polished wooden panels and brass fittings rolled smoothly along well-maintained streets, carrying gentlemen in top hats and ladies with parasols to social calls, exclusive shops, and afternoon teas. Children in these neighborhoods wore pressed clothing and received education from private tutors, their futures as secure as the foundations of the grand houses they called home. "Mother says we're to attend the exhibition at the Crystal Palace next week," announced young William Harrington as he joined his mother at breakfast, his collar starched and his hair neatly combed. "Father has secured special passes through his connection to the Royal Society." Yet merely 3 miles eastward, across invisible but impenetrable social boundaries, 12-year-old Thomas Finch awakened to a very different London. The narrow room he shared with 6 others in Whitechapel had no marble, no orchids, and certainly no butler. Instead, the ceiling leaked when it rained, and the single window admitted barely enough light to see the worn floorboards beneath his bare feet. "Up with you now, boy," growled Mr. Skinner, the master sweep who had purchased Thomas's labor from the workhouse 2 years prior. "Them chimneys in Cheapside won't clean themselves, and the coal dust pays for the bread you eat." Thomas rubbed his eyes, still burning from yesterday's work, and reached for the thin shirt that never quite came clean, no matter how vigorously his mother scrubbed it in their weekly allowance of water. His small frame, kept deliberately undernourished by Mr. Skinner to ensure he could fit into the narrowest of chimney flues, shivered in the morning chill as he prepared for another day of darkness and soot. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice barely audible as he suppressed a cough. The constant inhalation of ash and creosote had already begun its slow work on his young lungs, a common affliction among London's estimated 5,000 child chimney sweeps. The streets of the East End bore no resemblance to their western counterparts. Here open sewers ran alongside unpaved roads, and the buildings leaned precariously toward one another, blocking what little sunlight might have reached the ground. Women with hollow cheeks hung laundry on lines stretched between tenements, the garments rarely drying completely in the perpetually damp air. Children with no shoes played in gutters, their games interrupted by carts carrying the dead, victims of the cholera that regularly swept through these crowded neighborhoods, where dozens might share a single water pump. Dividing these two Londons, yet connecting them in an inescapable embrace, flowed the River Thames, the great artery of commerce that had made the city's fortune possible. Near Westminster, ladies and gentlemen might stroll along its embankment, commenting on the majestic flow of the river that brought goods from across the empire. "How fortunate we are," remarked Lord Harrington to his business associate as they watched ships unload tea from India and cotton from Egypt, "to live in a city at the center of the world's trade." His companion nodded in agreement, both men careful to breathe through scented handkerchiefs that filtered the river's increasingly noticeable stench. For the Thames served not only as London's commercial lifeline, but also as its main sewer. Each day, the waste of 2.5 million people poured untreated into the same waters that provided drinking water for much of the population. By midday, as Thomas climbed his third chimney of the morning, the river had turned a murky brown-green beneath the summer sun, bubbling with noxious gases that rose to join the coal smoke in London's infamous fog. "Mind you don't fall in if you're crossing the bridge today," Mr. Skinner warned as he collected Thomas for their afternoon appointments. "A boy from Billingsgate slipped in last week and was dead of the stink before they fished him out." In the mansions of Mayfair, servants closed windows against the smell, while their employers discussed the season's social events over imported wines. In the tenements of Spitalfields, families had no such luxury, enduring not only the river's stench but also the diseases it carried into their homes through contaminated water and miasmic air. The same empire that had built the magnificent Houses of Parliament along the Thames had yet to solve the basic sanitation needs of its capital city, a contradiction that would soon reach crisis proportions. As evening fell across London, gas lamps created pools of yellow light that illuminated the stark divisions of Victorian society. In the West End, Lady Eleanor prepared for an evening at the opera, her lady's maid carefully arranging diamonds in her hair. "The Duke of Wellington himself may be in attendance tonight," she told her husband with barely contained excitement. "How fortunate we are to live in such times, in such a magnificent city." Miles away, Thomas finally returned to his family's single room, his face and hands still bearing the marks of the day's labor, despite his best efforts to wash at a public pump. His younger sisters crowded around him as he produced a half loaf of bread, payment from a kindly cook at one of the houses where he'd worked. "Tell us about the big houses, Tommy," begged 6-year-old Mary, her eyes wide with wonder. "Do they really have rooms just for sitting in?" Thomas nodded wearily, too exhausted to elaborate on the marble fireplaces he had glimpsed through the chimneys, the paintings in gilded frames, and the tables laden with more food than his family would see in a month. Between these two Londons, one of excess, one of deprivation, the great river continued its flow, carrying away the evidence of humanity's presence while bringing the commerce that sustained the empire's heart. And above it all, the famous London fog settled for the night, temporarily obscuring, but never truly hiding, the brutal inequalities of a city experiencing both the triumph and tragedy of the Victorian age. The morning bell rang through the stone walls of the Whitechapel workhouse, a sound that struck dread into the hearts of all who dwelled within. Men, women, and children stirred from their sparse sleeping quarters, rising in unison like a well-trained army, not of soldiers, but of the destitute. "Up! Everyone up!" bellowed the workhouse master, Mr. Grimshaw, a man whose very name seemed crafted for his profession. "Idle hands bring the devil's work, and there'll be none of that under my watch." For those who had fallen on desperate times in Victorian London, The workhouse represented both salvation and prison. Families who entered were immediately separated, fathers to the men's ward, mothers to the women's, and children to dormitories where childhood itself was methodically stripped away. 8-year-old William Perkins had arrived just 3 days prior, his father dead from consumption and his mother unable to feed 4 hungry mouths on a washerwoman's pittance. "Remember, boy," she had whispered as the gates closed between them, "this is temporary. We'll be together again when fortune smiles." But fortune rarely smiled on the workhouse poor. William's small hands were already raw from picking oakum, unraveling old ropes into individual fibers, a task that left fingers bleeding and spirits broken. "Faster, boy," the overseer would demand, striking his cane against the wooden table whenever William's pace slowed. "The parish doesn't feed the lazy." The oakum would later be sold to shipbuilders as caulking material, one of many ways the workhouse extracted profit from desperation. In the women's section, William's mother, Catherine, joined dozens of others, washing laundry in scalding water and harsh lye soap that burned their skin and left their hands permanently reddened and cracked. The monotonous rhythm of scrubbing, wringing, and hanging became the heartbeat of their existence, punctuated only by meager meals of watery gruel and stale bread. "Keep moving," the matron would call, her voice carrying the practiced indifference of one who had learned to see human suffering as mere inefficiency. "There are 20 more loads before dinner." Across London, in the industrial district of Bermondsey, 14-year-old Sarah Matthews had already been at her station in the textile mill for 3 hours, though the clock had barely struck 8 in the morning. Unlike the workhouse inmates, Sarah was considered fortunate. She had employment after all. Yet her days were scarcely less brutal, stretched across 14 hours of vigilant attention to the massive mechanical looms that transformed raw cotton into fabric for the empire's insatiable markets. "Mind the shuttle, girl," shouted Mr. Hobbs, the floor manager, as Sarah's eyes momentarily drooped from exhaustion. "One mistake costs more than your week's wages." Sarah snapped back to attention, her thin fingers darting between the thundering mechanisms to clear a tangle of thread. All around her, children as young as 7 and women of all ages performed similar tasks, their bodies mere extensions of the machines they tended. The air hung thick with cotton fibers that coated their lungs and clothing, while the deafening clatter of hundreds of looms made conversation impossible and gradually stole their hearing. Sarah had seen the consequences of inattention too many times to grow careless. Just last month, young Eliza from the neighboring village had reached too far into a spinning jenny, and the machine had claimed 3 of her fingers before it could be stopped. The factory owner had docked her final pay for the blood that had stained the cotton. "You're lucky to have work at all," the women would remind each other during their brief meal breaks. "Better the mill than the workhouse or the streets." As dusk approached and Sarah's workday finally ended, she emerged into the notorious London fog that had descended while she labored indoors. This was no ordinary mist, but a toxic miasma locals called the pea super, a thick yellow-green blanket formed from coal smoke, factory emissions, and the fetid exhalations of the Thames. Sarah pulled her thin shawl across her mouth and nose, though it offered little protection against the poisonous air that burned her eyes and throat as she navigated the narrow streets toward home. Home for Sarah was a single room in a crumbling tenement building in 7 Dials, shared with her widowed mother and 3 younger siblings. The building housed 28 families across its 5 floors, with a single water pump in the courtyard and 2 privies serving all residents. As Sarah climbed the rickety stairs, the sounds and smells of overcrowded humanity assaulted her senses. Babies crying, couples arguing, the reek of unwashed bodies and cooking cabbage, and beneath it all, the persistent odor of the open sewers that ran along the streets outside. "Sarah, thank heavens!" her mother exclaimed as she entered their room. "Little Mary's fever's risen again." In the corner, Sarah's 6-year-old sister lay on a thin pallet, her face flushed and breathing labored. The room's only window had been stuffed with rags to keep out the deadly fog, but this also trapped the heat and stale air inside. Disease was a constant companion in these crowded quarters. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, and countless unnamed fevers swept regularly through the slums, finding easy prey among the malnourished and exhausted poor. "I've brought bread," Sarah said, producing a small loaf she'd purchased with part of her weekly earnings. "And Mrs. Finch from the 3rd floor gave me some wilted cabbage from the market." Such small kindnesses were the currency of survival in the tenements. While the wealthy West End residents could retreat to country estates when disease threatened, the poor of East London had nowhere to escape the epidemics that flourished in their cramped conditions. That night, as Sarah bathed her sister's forehead with water from their precious daily allotment, a hacking cough echoed through the thin wall from the neighboring room. Old Mr. Jenkins, a former dock worker, had been fighting the white death of tuberculosis for months. "The fog's particularly bad tonight," Sarah's mother observed quietly, glancing toward the sealed window. "They say 3 children were found dead on Flower and Dean Street this morning. Just wandered lost in the fog until they succumbed." Sarah nodded grimly, knowing that tomorrow would bring another 14-hour shift at the mill, another day of dangerous labor for meager wages that barely kept starvation at bay. Yet as brutal as life was in Victorian London's slums, there remained an unspoken resilience among those who endured it, a stubborn determination to find dignity, even in the shadow of the workhouse, to create community, even in the toxic fog, to preserve humanity, even when treated as mere cogs in the great industrial machine that powered the world's most powerful empire. The morning fog had begun to lift over Spitalfields Market as old Maggie arranged her modest collection of bruised apples and day-old bread on her weathered wooden cart. At 73 years of age, her gnarled fingers moved with practiced efficiency despite the arthritis that plagued her during these damp autumn mornings. She had been selling whatever meager goods she could acquire for nearly 4 decades, watching London transform around her while the plight of its poorest remained largely unchanged. "Fresh apples, 2d each. Day-old bread. Still good," she called, her voice carrying the raspy quality of someone who had spent a lifetime in London's polluted air. Maggie paused mid-arrangement when she noticed 3 small figures huddled near the corner of Bell Lane. The children, none older than 8 or 9 years, wore tattered clothing that hung from their thin frames, their faces smudged with the omnipresent London grime. She recognized the hollow-eyed look of hunger, having seen it countless times before in this neighborhood, where death and destitution were constant companions. "You there," she called to them, her voice softening. "Come here, little ones." The children hesitated, exchanging wary glances before the oldest, a girl with tangled brown hair, cautiously approached the cart. "We haven't any money, ma'am," the girl said, her voice barely audible above the market's morning bustle. Behind her, the 2 younger children, a boy with a badly mended jacket and a smaller girl whose shoes were bound with twine, stared longingly at the food. Maggie's weathered face creased into a gentle smile. "Your names, children?" she asked, already reaching for 3 of her least damaged apples. When they hesitated, she added, "I'm Maggie. Been selling at this very spot since before your parents were born, I'd wager." "I'm Jane," the oldest finally offered. "These are my brother Henry and sister Alice. Our mother died of the fever last month. Father's been gone 3 years now." The matter-of-fact way the child delivered this devastating news spoke volumes about how commonplace such tragedy was in the slums of Victorian London. Maggie nodded, having heard countless similar stories throughout her decades at the market. Without ceremony, She wrapped 3 apples and half a loaf in a scrap of newspaper and extended the bundle toward Jane. "Here, take it. No charge today." When the children stared in disbelief, she added more gruffly, "Go on, then, before I change my mind." As the children gratefully accepted her offering, Maggie noticed Mr. Finch, Thomas's father, watching from nearby. The man gave her a subtle nod of approval, despite his own family's desperate circumstances. This scene played out regularly across London's poorest neighborhoods, where those with almost nothing somehow found ways to share what little they had. In Whitechapel, Mrs. O'Brien, whose husband had been killed in a dockyard accident the previous year, regularly took in neighborhood children while their parents worked, feeding them watery soup stretched with whatever vegetables she could afford. In Seven Dials, Mr. Patterson, a cobbler with a crippled leg, repaired children's shoes for free when he knew their families couldn't pay, often working by candlelight long after his paying work was done. When cholera swept through the tenements of Jacob's Island in the summer of 1854, it was not doctors or authorities who provided the most immediate relief, but neighbors themselves. Sarah Matthews and her family had been spared the worst of the outbreak, and despite their own poverty, her mother had gone door to door with clean water and vinegar-soaked cloths, tending to the sick when many others fled in fear. "We survived together or not at all," she told Sarah when the girl asked why they shared their meager supplies. "That's the only way folk like us make it through." Even in the workhouse, where conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage all but the most desperate from seeking assistance, small acts of compassion flourished in defiance of the system's cruelty. William Perkins had witnessed older boys secretly sharing their bread rations with younger children, and workhouse women finding ways to pass messages between separated family members. These tiny rebellions against institutional callousness preserved a thread of humanity in places designed to strip it away. As the 1850s progressed into the 60s, voices began to rise against the brutal conditions endured by London's poor. Charles Dickens, whose novels vividly portrayed the suffering of children like Thomas and Sarah, had already stirred public consciousness with works like Oliver Twist and Bleak House. His writings forced comfortable middle-class readers to confront the human cost of their prosperity, describing in unflinching detail the squalor that existed mere streets away from their comfortable homes. Social reformers like Lord Shaftesbury campaigned tirelessly for legislation to protect child workers, resulting in a series of factory acts that gradually restricted the employment of children under 13 years of age. The Mines and Collieries Act of 1842 had already prohibited children under 10 from working underground. Though enforcement remained spotty and desperate, families often falsified ages to secure vital income. In Whitechapel, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell established a small clinic where she treated poor women and children regardless of their ability to pay, training other women as nurses and health visitors who ventured into the worst slums to provide basic care and hygiene education. Though her resources were limited, her work represented a growing recognition that the suffering of London's poor was not inevitable, but the result of specific social and economic conditions that could, and should, be addressed. The Metropolitan Poor Act of 1867 finally acknowledged the government's responsibility to provide medical care for the destitute, establishing infirmaries separate from the dreaded workhouses. Though inadequate by modern standards, this legislation represented a significant shift in attitudes toward poverty and public health. For families like Thomas's and Sarah's, these changes came painfully slowly, but they signaled the beginning of reforms that would eventually transform urban life. On a cold December evening in 1868, Thomas Finch, now 17 and no longer small enough to work as a chimney sweep, stood among a crowd gathered in Trafalgar Square to hear speakers demand voting rights for working men. The Reform Act passed the previous year had extended suffrage to many urban working-class men, though the poorest remained disenfranchised. Still, Thomas felt a cautious hope as he listened to the orators. Perhaps his children, should he live long enough to have them, might know a London where survival wasn't such a brutal daily struggle.